welcome to our Read Aloud. We have a wonderfully special guest today. Nancy Petrie has written a book called False Justice, 8 Myths That Convict
the
Innocent. And it's a wonderful title because it really makes you raise an eyebrow. It piques your interest. And of course, she is a co-author on this with her husband, Jim, who is the new Chancellor of Public Education in Ohio and the former state Ohio Attorney General. So this is coming from the voice of experience. So if I may, I don't know much about you, but if you'd like to start off by introducing yourself and saying a little bit about yourself and your husband and how this book came to be.
Sure.
That would probably be a good starting place, and I'll turn it over to you completely.
Thank you very much, Ruth. As you said, my name is Nancy Petrie, and I've had a background. I graduated from Denison University with a fine arts, graphic design, visual arts major. Didn't take a writing course really in college, but had a 20-year career in graphic design and marketing, and then went into entrepreneurship. I launched a national high school sports magazine in 1995 and grew it for 5 years. It was called All Stater Sports. But I ended up not writing there much either because I ended up having to sell advertising and run a business and try to keep it afloat, which is a big challenge with a magazine. And then I became the CEO of a software company. And all along I was helping my husband in his political life. He was a lawyer, and then he ran for political life. He was everything from a state rep for 4 terms to state auditor, county commissioner in Cuyahoga County, state auditor for 2 terms, and then attorney general. He ran for the Republican primary for governor in 2006 and did not prevail. And so then he went into private practice. But as attorney general, he led his main initiative, one of his main initiatives, was to try to utilize DNA to solve crime. DNA was coming of age. And he very easily got the support of the legislature to expand the authority of the Attorney General to take a swab, a DNA sampling of every convicted felon in Ohio and every high-level misdemeanor. And of course, when they then took those samples and put them in what is the national database of crime scene DNA called CODIS, instantly they solved dozens, hundreds really, of crimes, cold cases. So it was a very exciting time for law enforcement when they began to see the potential and started to see the flowering of the potential of DNA. But what happened was a shock to someone who spent his life in criminal justice and law when he started discovering that there were people in prison that DNA was proving were also innocent. And so he got involved. He was drawn into a case, and that's where the book begins. I'll just tell you that, we've been married for 38 years. We talk a lot, and so everything that Jim was experiencing, other than what's privileged between a lawyer and his clients, I was learning too, and that was something that started really preying on both of us. This haunting feeling that there were innocent people in prison. And so one night I was awakened in the middle of a dream, and there was great clarity to this, what I now feel was called to write a book on this, on what we had learned, and also to try to use it as a vehicle to answer the questions that all of this had prompted in both of us. And that occurred in March of 2008. And for the next 2.5 to 3 years, I really worked on the writing of the book. The stories are Jim's. It's in a memoir format. It's his person. So as I read this, you have to imagine I'm Jim. And when he talks about Nancy, that's me. But I'm just going to start and see how much time we have on this. I'm going to start with the very first chapter. And I'm going to skip around going through the book and give you little capsules of it. I will say that it's really 2 strains that are woven in this book. One is narrative. Everything about it's nonfiction. One is narrative, and that's Jim's story. He's trying to bring everyone through the same experiences to have the same sort of awakening that we did. But then the other one is the answers to the questions. So that's the research, and that's some of the information that's woven into this. The whole idea is to try to get people not only involved in the criminal justice system, but to make it readable enough that the general audience would read this book and it would become a primer on criminal justice. So chapter 1, the devil cheats justice. An unexplained murder changes a small town irreversibly. In a major city, the daily media parade of tragedies, the fires, the accidents, and the murders is numbing. The victims and their shocked families are strangers, which makes it easier to put their sad stories out of mind. But in a small town, not a suburb, but a complete community in a sea of countryside, a murder is much more personal. I don't even close my doors or lock my windows at night, as often volunteered as proud testimony to the benefits of living in a small town, until the discovery of an unspeakable act of savage violence, which has somehow occurred with no living witness. A bereft family member and stunned safety officials can barely take in the brutality, the senseless loss, and the disheartening truth. They have arrived on the scene way too late. Stomach-turning revulsion and grief are mocked by delicate curtains waving gently in the breeze of open windows. Within hours, the town is transformed. Everyone is talking about the murder. Even though the victim is not especially prominent, she is nevertheless one of us. The shock of the crime is accompanied by the frightening recognition that the killer may also be one of us. Fear is palpable. No security system or shiny new locks on doors and windows bring even a hint of the sense of security once taken for granted. The entire town is on edge. If the crime remains unsolved, life remains very gradually. It will very gradually come to normal, but to a changed normal. The town will never be the same. If a suspect is caught, indicted, and brought to trial, everyone in town focuses on the next step. They expect justice, meaning a conviction. If the alleged perpetrator is a local, people begin to recall little things. Offhand remarks, unsettling relationships, odd behaviors. Yes, in retrospect, they should have known. One person experiences unique anxiety, the elected county prosecutor, who has never prosecuted a capital case, feels growing pressure not to blow it, not to overlook anything, not to miss or mishandle evidence, not to get trumped by the defense attorney who has come to town for the duration of the trial. Wisely, the county prosecutor takes the advice of colleagues and asks for assistance from the Office of the Ohio Attorney General. That is when, as Attorney General, I would turn to Chief Deputy for Criminal Justice Jim Canepa. He or one of his staff prosecutors would carefully review the files, drive to the small town, and prosecute the case before the trial in the county courthouse with the county prosecutor sitting by his side. Canepa's boyish appearance and casual style often masks professional talents in early discussions with defense attorneys. He is known for his playful banter and quick, funny comebacks, which put most folks at ease and even off guard. But when focused in a courtroom, that mental quickness is an advantage in the unpredictable verbal exchanges with witnesses, attorneys, and judges. Lean and athletic-looking, Canepa comes to trial prepared and confident, just short of cocky. But he speaks with a down-to-earth, eye-to-eye delivery, as if he's talking confidentially to you and you alone, that connects immediately with just about everyone, including jurors. His manner in court may appear to be laid back, another attribute that charms his audience, but Canepa knows exactly what to do in a capital case. He is a prosecutor's prosecutor. That is why, in the small-town murder case that resulted in the conviction of Clarence Elkins, it was unusual when I asked Canepa to apply his considerable advocacy skills on behalf of the imprisoned man convicted of murder and rape. 7.5 years after he was convicted and sent to prison, DNA analysis had excluded Clarence Elkins from the crime scene of 2 rapes and a murder. Canepa looked into the matter at my request, and we came to the shared conclusion that Elkins was innocent. But the jurisdiction's elected county prosecutor and common pleas judge refused to respond to our concerns about evidence of an error that had imprisoned an innocent man and let a guilty one go free. Can you hear me? Is that part okay? All right. I'm going to move a little bit ahead, and I'll give you just a little bit of the story of Clarence Elkins. The book actually covers in some depth 3 Ohio cases. So the first one was the Clarence Elkins case. That fateful Sunday, June 7th, 1998, started out sleepy, as most Sundays did, until Melinda Elkins spotted an officer in SWAT gear, gun drawn, running just outside the large picture window of her mobile home. Then all hell broke loose. In the bewildering moments that followed, Melinda struggled to absorb multiple jolts of incomprehensible news in the midst of total chaos. Her eventual testimony in court would detail a nightmare. Melinda didn't realize that officers of the Carroll County Sheriff's Department had surged onto the Elkins property, 4 acres in Magnolia, Ohio, acquired for the house that she and her husband Clarence hoped to build someday. Clarence had heard something, though, and stepped out the back door. Within an instant, a sheriff's deputy was at the front door. He directed Melinda and her younger son to a porch where Melinda could not see what was going on outside on the other side of the home. There, Clarence was running toward their older son, 15, who was handcuffed on the ground, surrounded by officers with their guns pointed at him. As the deputy ushered Melinda and her son onto the porch, he asked, "Are you Clarence Elkins' girlfriend?" "No, I'm his wife," answered Melinda, bewildered. She and Clarence had been married for 17 years. Then he told the boy to go back inside so that the young teenager would not hear what he was about to say. "What is your mother's name?" the sheriff's deputy asked Melinda. "Judith Johnson," she said, begging him to tell her what was wrong. "Was her mother okay?" "No," he answered. Then he told her the awful truth. In an instant, she learned that her mother had been murdered, her niece had been sexually assaulted, and her husband Clarence had been named as the attacker. The crimes had taken place sometime earlier that morning at her mother's home in Barberton, nearly an hour's drive away. "I was hysterical," Melinda recalled. "My mind was going back and forth between my mom being killed and them saying it was Clarence." By this time, the Barberton police had also arrived on the scene. Realizing that they had cuffed the wrong person, officers began to take the cuffs off Clarence's son. Hearing his mother screaming, the teenager jumped up with one cuff still dangling from his wrist and ran into the home to find her. He knew why she was crying. When the officers had cuffed him and laid him out on the ground, they told him they were arresting him for the murder of Judith Johnson, his grandmother. The officers then rushed to cuff Clarence Elkins, who was as confused as the rest of the family about what was happening. Melinda called her relatives on both sides of the family. The news had already gotten to some of them, which confirmed what Melinda did not want to believe. She immediately consented to having her property searched that morning. 2 officers spent hours meticulously looking for evidence in the Elkins' home and their 2 cars. Detective Jim Weiss of the Barberton police asked Melinda to sit down in the kitchen, where he proceeded to read the shocked woman her rights. The fact that she would be treated with suspicion was another part of this nightmare. Clarence's brother, having heard the family phone calls, what was happening, came over just as Clarence was being taken away by the police. Clarence trusted the police and the system. He indicated to his brother from the police car that everything would be okay. His brother stayed with Melinda and the boys and watched incredulously as the police did their work. As the detectives were leaving, he overheard Charlie Snyder, an agent from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, say to another detective, "We don't have anything here." While the investigation of the Elkins' property was taking place, Clarence was undergoing questioning at the Barberton police station. He never resisted and cooperated when a detective asked to scrape his fingernails and photograph his hands for evidence. Clarence knew that he was innocent and trusted that he would be home that evening. Instead, he slept in the Summit County Jail that night. He would not be back in his own bed for 8 years. That's an example of the narrative